It is 1821, and somewhere in the dusty plains of Bengal, a 19-year-old widow named Sunita stands before a funeral pyre. Her husband had died 3 days earlier from cholera, and now, dressed in her finest wedding silks, she is about to climb onto that pyre and burn alive alongside his corpse. Throughout history, humans have believed some truly wild things. We've worshipped the sun, prayed to volcanoes, and convinced ourselves that bleeding people cured diseases. Now, we are not about to judge ancient people by modern standards, but we are about to understand how strong and extreme beliefs can be, that even though it got people killed, somehow everyone involved thought, yeah, this seems totally reasonable. Join me as we explore how faith, when taken to its most extreme conclusion, doesn't just move mountains, it buries people under them. Let's start in ancient India, around 500 BCE, where one of history's most controversial practices would persist for over 2,000 years. Imagine you're a young woman in ancient India. You just got married and life looks pretty good, but your society has already decided your fate, not based on anything you'll do, but on a single terrible possibility: your husband's death. The practice was called Sati, named after the goddess Sati, who self-immolated in Hindu mythology, and here's how it worked. When a Hindu man died, his widow was expected to prove her eternal devotion in the most horrific way imaginable. She would climb onto his funeral pyre and burn alive alongside his corpse. Let that sink in for a moment. Your husband dies of illness, accident, old age, or whatever you can think of. You're expected to die too. But if the wife dies first, her body gets cremated according to tradition. The husband would mourn briefly, and then he'd find a new wife to cook his meals and produce more children. The belief system had all the spiritual justification you'd expect. Ancient texts suggested that a widow burning with her husband would purify both their souls, guarantee them 7 lifetimes of happiness together in the afterlife, and bring immense honor to both families. It was portrayed as the ultimate act of wifely devotion. But here's the disturbing reality behind the spiritual justification. Widows in ancient Indian society existed in a kind of social death, even before physical death. They basically had no rights. They couldn't remarry. They couldn't inherit property. They were considered as bad luck. Many were forced to shave their heads, wear only white, eat severely restricted diets, and live in isolation from society. For many families, a widow represented nothing more than a financial burden. Sati solved that problem while cloaking it in religious virtue. Talk of killing 2 birds with 1 stone, or in this case, 1 widow with 1 very large fire. The ceremonies themselves were public spectacles that entire villages would gather to witness. Drums would beat, mantras would be chanted endlessly. The widow would be dressed in her finest wedding clothes, covered in jewelry that glittered in the firelight, and paraded through the streets like a bride going to her wedding. Except this wedding ended in flames. Here's where the story gets even darker. Some women went willingly, genuinely believing in the spiritual reward promised to them, but let's be real, many didn't. Historical accounts describe widows being drugged with opium or alcohol before the ceremony to make them compliant. Some were tied to the pyre with ropes, others were held down by bamboo poles as they screamed and tried to escape the flames. Family members would surround the burning pyre specifically to prevent escape. When British colonizers began documenting this practice in the 1600s and 1700s, they were horrified. Official records from Bengal alone show that between 1815 and 1818, over 600 widows were being burned alive every single year in just one region. Multiply that across all of India over 2,000 years, and historians estimate anywhere from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of women who died this way. The practice wasn't ended by British colonizers alone, though. Indian reformers like Raja Ram Mohan Roy fought tirelessly against Sati, arguing brilliantly that it had no basis in the original Hindu texts and represented a corruption of Hindu philosophy rather than its essence. In 1829, the British government officially banned Sati throughout India, but official bans don't erase beliefs overnight. The practice continued illegally in remote areas for decades, even centuries afterward. The last widely reported case occurred in 1987, when 18-year-old Roop Kanwar was burned in Rajasthan, sparking international outrage and proving that even in the modern world, these ancient beliefs retain terrifying power. Today, scattered across India, you can still find Sati stones memorials marking the spots where women burned. Each one represents a life that ended not by choice, but by a belief system that valued tradition and family honor over human life itself. If you're finding this deep dive into history as fascinating and disturbing as I did researching it, do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe. Also make sure to watch to the end, because we've got 5 more examples that'll make you question everything about human decision-making, and what's coming next involves kings who thought death was a team sport. From India, we travel to the cradles of civilization, ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, and China, where another deadly belief claimed thousands upon thousands of lives. Kings and emperors had a simple philosophy. If I'm going to the afterlife, I'm bringing my entire staff with me. The belief was deceptively simple. The dead needed servants in the afterlife. This wasn't about honoring the deceased. This was about control extending beyond death itself, about power so absolute that it could demand your life, even when it had no further use for you. In ancient Egypt, around 3000 BCE, the pharaoh wasn't just a king, he was a living god, and when a living god died, he needed his servants, guards, cooks, musicians, and even his concubines to continue attending to him in the afterlife. So when a pharaoh died, his servants didn't just lose their employment, they lost their lives. Archaeologists have found early Egyptian royal tombs surrounded by dozens of smaller graves, all sealed at precisely the same time. These weren't volunteers. These were people who served the pharaoh in life and were now being given a non-optional employment extension into death. Some were poisoned, others had their throats cut. The exact method varied, but the outcome was always the same. Your final paycheck was death. But Egypt wasn't even the most extreme example. In the royal cemetery of in ancient Mesopotamia, archaeologist Leonard Woolley made a chilling discovery in the 1920s that still gives people nightmares. In the tomb of Queen Puabi, dating to 2600 BCE, he found the skeletal remains of 74 attendants. The scene he uncovered was chilling in its orderliness. These people had been dressed in elaborate ceremonial clothes. They'd apparently walked into the tomb in a solemn procession, taking their assigned positions. Musicians lay beside their instruments, lyres and harps positioned as if they'd just finished playing. Guards stood at attention with spears. Court ladies wore their finest jewelry. Then the tomb was sealed and they were left to die. Evidence suggests they drank poison from cups that were found clutched in their skeletal hands. They dressed up, walked in, drank poison, laid down, and waited for darkness to claim them. But if you think that's extreme, let's talk about ancient China during the Shang dynasty from 1600 to 1046 BCE. The Shang believed that ancestors wielded enormous power over the living. They could bring fortune or unleash disaster, provide bountiful harvests or devastating famines. So when a Shang king died, it wasn't dozens who were sacrificed, it was hundreds. Excavations of Shang royal tombs have revealed over 400 sacrificed individuals in single tombs. Some were beheaded, others were buried alive. Their skeletons were found in contorted positions, arms reaching upward, clearly struggling, trying desperately to claw their way out. Here's what makes it even more disturbing. Not all of these victims were servants. Many were war captives, enslaved people from conquered territories, sacrificed specifically to serve as slaves in the afterlife. Even in death, the Shang kings demanded a hierarchy. This brings us to one of the most famous tombs in history, that of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China, who died in 210 BCE. You've probably heard of his terracotta army, those thousands of life-sized clay soldiers discovered in the 1970s, standing in eternal formation to protect their emperor. But here's what most people don't realize. Those clay soldiers replaced real human sacrifice. Historical records suggest that in earlier dynasties, those would have been real soldiers, killed and buried in formation. The ancient historian Sima Qian, writing about a century after the emperor's death, recorded something even more chilling. He claimed that when the first emperor was entombed, All the craftsmen who'd built the inner tomb chambers were sealed inside alive so they couldn't reveal its secrets. The emperor's childless concubines were also buried with him, hundreds of people potentially entombed alive in darkness. The exact numbers are debated and likely exaggerated, but the practice itself is well documented across multiple civilizations spanning thousands of years. Retainer sacrifice gradually declined in most societies. In Egypt, it largely ended after the early dynastic period, replaced by servant statues, paintings, and inscribed spells that promised magical servants in the afterlife. In China, it continued sporadically, flaring up during certain dynasties, fading during others, until finally being abolished during the Ming dynasty in the 1400s CE. But for thousands of years across multiple continents, the belief that death required company claimed countless lives. These weren't criminals or soldiers dying in battle. They were people whose only misfortune was serving the wrong master at the wrong time. We now move to medieval Europe and ancient legal systems worldwide, where the justice system had a unique approach to determining guilt or innocence. Justice wasn't determined by evidence or reason, but by your ability to survive torture. Imagine you were accused of a crime, perhaps theft, adultery, heresy, or murder. You insist you're innocent. There are no witnesses to support your claim, no physical evidence either way. Just you, a judge, and a very uncomfortable question. How do we know if you are lying? The court needs to determine the truth, so they heat a metal rod until it glows red hot, pulsing with heat. They make you grasp it with your bare hand and carry it for 9 feet. Then they bandage your burned hand and wait 3 days. If the wound is healing cleanly when they unwrap it, you're innocent and free to go. If it's infected, and in the medieval period it almost certainly would be, then you're guilty and will be executed. This was called trial by ordeal, and for roughly 8 centuries it was considered a perfectly reasonable method of determining guilt or innocence. The underlying belief was pretty straightforward. God would intervene to protect the innocent. If you were truly guiltless, the divine would perform a miracle on your behalf. You wouldn't burn, you wouldn't drown, you wouldn't die from poison, you wouldn't choke on holy bread. The Almighty would make your innocence physically manifest. There were so many creative variations of the trial across different cultures and time periods. There was trial by hot iron, where you'd carry red-hot metal, trial by hot water, where you'd plunge your hand into boiling water to retrieve a stone from the bottom, trial by cold water, where you'd be bound hand and foot and thrown into a river. If you floated, you were guilty because pure water rejected sinners. If you sank, you were innocent, though you might drown before they pulled you out. There was even trial by cross, where the accused and accuser would stand with their arms outstretched in a cross position. Whoever lowered their arms first was lying, so basically, whoever had better upper body strength was innocent. In Anglo-Saxon England, there was even trial by corsned. You'd be forced to eat consecrated bread and cheese. If you choked, you were guilty, because apparently God himself was causing the holy food to stick in your throat as punishment for your lies. How many people died in these ordeals? The records are fragmentary, scattered across centuries and kingdoms, but we know trials by ordeal were extremely common throughout medieval Europe and in many other cultures, from roughly 500 CE to 1300 CE. In just one English county, surviving records show dozens of ordeals conducted each year. Multiply that across all of Europe for 8 centuries, and you're looking at hundreds of thousands of trials. A significant percentage ended in death or permanent injury, and most of these people were probably innocent. Let's talk about the medical reality. Third-degree burns almost always became infected in the medieval period. There were no antibiotics, no understanding of germ theory, no proper wound care. People with infected burns developed sepsis and died agonizing deaths. In cold water ordeals, people drowned while being proven innocent underwater. Here's the tragic irony that makes this practice even more disturbing. Innocent people likely failed these tests more often than the guilty. Why? Because if you were actually guilty, you knew you were doomed regardless, so you might confess before the ordeal to avoid the additional torture. But innocent people insisted on undergoing the trial, believing that God would vindicate and save them. And there's a cruel psychological dimension here. Innocent people, terrified and desperate, would have been flooded with stress hormones, cortisol and adrenaline surging through their systems. These hormones actively impair wound healing. Their burns would be more likely to become infected. So the more innocent you were, the more likely you were to fail the test. The practice finally began to end in 1215 when the Fourth Lateran Council, one of the most important church councils in history, forbade clergy from participating in trials by ordeal. Without priests to consecrate the water, bless the iron, or invoke God's judgment, the entire system lost its religious legitimacy and gradually faded away. But this wasn't just medieval European insanity. In parts of Africa, accused criminals were forced to drink poison brewed from toxic plants. If you survived, you were innocent. If the poison killed you, you were guilty and had received your punishment. In India, the guilty were supposed to be bitten when a venomous snake was placed in a pot with them. In Borneo, accused parties would be submerged in water. Whoever could stay under longer was telling the truth. Even colonial America got in on the action. The Salem witch trials of 1692 in colonial Massachusetts used similar logic. Throw an accused witch into water. If she floats, she's guilty and should be hanged. If she sinks and drowns, she was innocent. 19 people were executed based on evidence that was just as reliable as medieval hot iron tests. Today, we pride ourselves on evidence-based justice systems. But for centuries, legal systems across the entire world operated on the belief that the supernatural would intervene in human affairs to reveal truth, and that belief got countless innocent people tortured, mutilated, and killed. Quick pause here. We're halfway through this investigation, and if you're still watching, you are clearly someone who appreciates dark history and you want to understand history's darkest truths. If you appreciate this deep research and storytelling, hit on that like button and subscribe. Now, let's continue with a story about a murder cult that operated for 600 years. We are heading back to India, but this time we're not talking about public ceremonies or government-sanctioned practices. We're looking at something that operated in the shadows, a secret society of ritual murderers who killed for their goddess. They were called the Thuggee, worshippers of Kali, the Hindu goddess of destruction and death, and for centuries they terrorized travelers across the Indian subcontinent, leaving behind a trail of bodies that may number in the hundreds of thousands. Here's how their operation worked, and it's chilling in its simplicity and effectiveness. You're a merchant traveling along one of India's dusty trade routes. You meet a group of friendly strangers on the road. They are charming men who seem like fellow travelers. They offer to journey together for safety, and you gratefully accept. After all, the roads are dangerous, and there's safety in numbers. These new companions are delightful. They share meals with you, tell entertaining stories, offer helpful advice about the road ahead. Over days of travel, they become trusted friends. You let your guard down completely. Then one night, at a predetermined signal, maybe a specific phrase or a whistle, sometimes just a meaningful glance, everything changes. They strike. Using a yellow ceremonial cloth called a rumal, one of your friends loops it around your neck from behind and strangles you. The strangulation is ritualistic, meant to be utterly silent, leaving no blood. Your body gets buried in an unmarked grave, often with specific religious rituals performed over it. Your possessions are stolen and divided among your killers, and the Thuggee move on to find their next victims. But here's what transformed this from simple banditry into a deadly belief. The Thuggee genuinely believed they were serving Kali. To them, each murder wasn't a crime, but an holy act, a sacrifice that brought them divine favor and prosperity. They had specific rituals, prayers, and strict rules about who could be killed, when, and how. The Thuggee operated in complete secrecy for centuries, passing their murderous traditions from father to son like a dark family trade. They might have remained unknown to history if not for British colonial administrator William Sleeman, who launched a massive campaign against them in the 1830s. Sleeman captured and interrogated thousands of suspected Thuggee. Their confessions were absolutely horrifying. Some claim to have personally participated in hundreds of murders. They described the techniques in meticulous detail, the rituals, the methods of disposing of bodies, the routes they travelled, the signs they used to communicate. One thug named Behram was accused of participating in 931 murders over a 40-year career. He's literally in the Guinness Book of World Records as one of history's most prolific murderers. Another, Buram Jemadar, confessed to 125 murders personally committed. These weren't wild exaggerations meant to intimidate. The Thuggee actually kept records of their kills, tracking them the way a craftsman might track completed projects. British estimates suggested that up to 40,000 people were being killed by Thuggee annually at the height of their operations in the early 19th century. Over the centuries of their existence, from roughly 1300 CE to the 1850s, the total death toll could range from hundreds of thousands to over 1 million people. Now here's where the historical picture gets complicated. Modern historians debate how much of the Thuggee threat was real versus British colonial propaganda. Some scholars argue the numbers were wildly inflated to justify British control over India and the brutal suppression campaign that followed. But the archaeological and documentary evidence supports at least some of the claims. Mass graves have been discovered along historic trade routes containing bodies buried in ways consistent with Thuggee practices. Court records show consistent patterns of traveller disappearances, and the confessions, while certainly obtained under duress and legal systems we'd consider unjust today, show detailed knowledge of secretive practices that couldn't have been simply invented. Between 1830 and 1850, the British captured about 3,700 suspected Thuggee. Nearly 500 were hanged. Over 3,000 were imprisoned for life or transported to penal colonies. The suppression campaign was absolutely brutal, and it definitely included innocent people caught up in the paranoia. What made the Thuggee particularly disturbing was the hereditary nature of the practice. This wasn't something you chose as an adult. Fathers trained sons in the art of ritual strangulation from childhood. Entire families participated across generations. It wasn't just organized crime, it was a religious tradition passed down like a sacred duty. By the 1870s, the Thuggee were essentially extinct. The British had broken their networks, imprisoned or executed their practitioners, and destroyed the hereditary transmission of knowledge that had sustained them for centuries. The English word thug comes directly from these ritual stranglers, by the way, but it's lost all religious context. We use it casually now to mean any violent criminal, not realizing it originally referred to people who genuinely believed that murder was worship, that strangulation was prayer, that killing travellers was their sacred duty to a goddess. The Thuggee raise an uncomfortable question. When does devotion become destruction? They genuinely believed they were serving their goddess, and that belief, whether based on truth or delusion, justified tens or hundreds of thousands of murders in their minds. We're now travelling to ancient Carthage on the Mediterranean coast of what's now Tunisia between 800 BCE and 146 BCE. And we're about to discuss one of the most controversial and horrific practices in all of ancient history, the sacrifice of children to appease the gods. For years, historians genuinely debated whether this actually happened at all or if it was just Roman propaganda against their enemies. Roman accounts described it in detail, but Romans were Carthage's mortal enemies, locked in a series of catastrophic wars that would eventually see Carthage utterly destroyed. Could this just be propaganda? Wartime demonization of their rivals to justify conquest and genocide? Then archaeologists found the Tophet, a sacred burial ground filled with thousands upon thousands of urns, each containing the cremated remains of infants and young children, sometimes mixed with the bones of small animals like lambs. The Carthaginians worshipped Baal Hammon and Tanit, powerful deities whose favour was believed to be essential for the city's prosperity. According to ancient sources, during times of severe crisis like droughts, famine, and plagues, the wealthy elite would sacrifice their firstborn children to appease these gods and restore divine favour. Roman and Greek historians describe a massive bronze statue of the god with outstretched arms. The statue would be heated from below with roaring fires until the metal arms glowed red hot. A living child would be placed in those burning arms, and drums would be beaten thunderously to drown out the screams. Whether this specific detail is accurate or Roman propaganda, we'll never know with certainty, but the archaeological evidence is undeniable. Modern excavations have found at least 20,000 urns in various Tophet sites across the Carthaginian world, not just in Carthage itself, but in colonies throughout the Mediterranean. Each urn represents at least one child, sometimes 2 or 3 from the same family buried together. Scientific analysis of the bones is where the debate gets intense. Some archaeologists argue that these were stillborn children or infants who died from natural causes in a society with high infant mortality, given special burials in a sacred space. The inscriptions on some urns mention fulfilling a vow, which could mean sacrifice or could simply mean fulfilling a promise to properly bury a naturally deceased child. But other evidence is absolutely damning. Many of the bones show signs of death by burning at temperatures and in ways consistent with live cremation rather than cremation of bodies that were already dead. The age distribution of the remains shows suspicious peaks at specific ages, particularly newborns and 3-year-olds, which doesn't match natural mortality patterns that would be more random. The ancient historian Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BCE, described events in 310 BCE when Carthage was under siege by a Greek army and was losing badly. He claimed that in a desperate attempt to regain divine favor and turn the tide of war, 200 children from the noblest families of Carthage were sacrificed in a single ceremony. Another 300 volunteers, meaning families who offered their children, were added to appease the god's wrath. 500 children burned in one desperate day. Here's the social dynamic that makes this even more disturbing. If wealthy, powerful families were expected to sacrifice their children during times of crisis, it became a terrible kind of status symbol. Refusing might mark you as impious, cowardly, or selfish. Families might feel enormous social pressure to participate, even when privately horrified, trapped between love for their children and fear of social and religious condemnation. Some evidence suggests that over time, religious authorities began allowing substitutions. Wealthy families could sacrifice lambs instead of children. This is why some urns contain only animal bones. But this substitution was probably expensive, available only to the rich, meaning poorer families still had to sacrifice their actual children while the wealthy could buy their way out. The practice ended completely when Rome destroyed Carthage in 146 BCE. They literally burned the city to the ground, killed or enslaved the population, and according to legend, salted the earth so nothing would ever grow there again. The Carthaginian culture was completely erased, their books burned, their temples demolished, and their people killed or enslaved. Today you can visit the Tophet site in Tunisia. It's a peaceful archaeological park with informational plaques and preserved ruins. But beneath your feet, mixed with the soil, are the remains of thousands of children who died because their parents believed the gods demanded it. We might desperately want to dismiss this as uniquely Carthaginian barbarism, but child sacrifice appears in disturbingly many ancient cultures. Biblical accounts mention it among ancient Canaanites and occasionally among Israelites. Archaeological evidence suggests it occurred in pre-Columbian Americas, ancient Celtic societies, and elsewhere across the ancient world. The question haunts every thinking person who studies this. How did entire civilizations convince themselves that killing children was not just acceptable but holy? How did parents participate in sacrificing their own offspring? How did societies normalize what should be the most unnatural act imaginable? The answer is deeply uncomfortable. When a society collectively believes something is divine will, even the most horrific act can be normalized, ritualized, and perpetuated for centuries. Religion provides uniquely powerful justifications that can override even the deepest human instincts, including the instinct to protect one's own children. If this video is making you think differently about how powerful belief systems can be, both for tremendous good and for unspeakable evil, then hit that like button right now and subscribe, because we're about to cover the most massive death toll of all 6 practices. I also want to hear from you in the comments. Do you think modern societies have blind spots like these ancient cultures did? What are we currently accepting that future generations will condemn? Drop your thoughts below. Now, let's journey to the Aztec Empire, where sacrifice reached industrial scale. Our final and most massive example takes us to the Aztec Empire of central Mexico from the 1300s until the Spanish conquest in 1521 CE. What we're about to discuss operated on a scale that dwarfs everything else we've covered today. The Aztecs believed the universe operated in cycles of creation and destruction. They lived in the fifth sun, which is technically the fifth version of the world. The previous four had been destroyed by catastrophes like jaguars, hurricanes, fiery rain, and flood. Their current sun, Tonatiuh, required constant nourishment to continue rising each day. That nourishment was human blood and human hearts. This was human sacrifice on a scale unprecedented in history. At the center of their magnificent capital, Tenochtitlan, built on an island in Lake Texcoco, where Mexico City now stands, stood the Templo Mayor, a massive dual pyramid dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and the sun, and Tlaloc, the god of rain and fertility. This is where the sacrifices happened. Here's how the ceremony worked. Captured warriors from enemy states would be led up the pyramid's steep steps, that's over 100 steps climbing toward the sky. At the top, on a stone altar positioned so the entire city could witness, priests would force the victim onto his back. Using an obsidian blade, which is basically volcanic glass, sharper than modern surgical steel, a priest would make an incision just below the ribs and reach inside to extract the still beating heart. The body would then be thrown down the pyramid steps, tumbling and breaking. The heart would be offered to the gods, and the skull would later be cleaned and displayed on massive skull racks called tzompantli that flanked the temple plaza, serving as both religious offerings and terrifying warnings. Spanish conquistador Andrés de Tapia, writing about what he witnessed when they first entered Tenochtitlan, claimed he personally counted one skull rack containing 136,000 skulls arranged in precise rows. That number was dismissed for centuries as wild exaggeration, Spanish propaganda meant to justify their conquest and forced conversion of the Aztecs. But in 2015 and 2017, archaeologists discovered actual skull racks buried beneath modern Mexico City. They've excavated over 650 skulls so far, including women and children, contradicting the long-held belief that only captured warriors were sacrificed. So how many people actually died? This is where the numbers become almost incomprehensible and heavily debated. Spanish conquistadors claim to witness sacrifices daily, sometimes dozens in a single day. Bernal Díaz del Castillo, one of Cortés's soldiers, who wrote a detailed account of the conquest, described seeing sacrifices regularly throughout their time in Tenochtitlan. Hernán Cortés himself documented what he claimed to have seen in reports back to Spain, but the most staggering claim comes from the 1487 reconsecration of the renovated and expanded Templo Mayor. According to Aztec sources recorded after the Spanish conquest, the ceremony lasted 4 days. Captives stood in 4 separate lines that stretched for miles outside the city. Multiple priests worked simultaneously at different altars. The number claimed in these accounts, 80,400 people sacrificed in 4 days. Modern historians are skeptical of this number, and with good reason. To sacrifice 80,000 people in 4 days would require killing someone approximately every 4 seconds, non-stop, for 96 hours straight. The logistics alone makes it physically impossible, even with multiple priests working in shifts. Most scholars now estimate the 1487 ceremony claimed between 4,000 and 20,000 lives, which is still an unimaginable horror, but at least mathematically possible. For regular annual sacrifices across the entire Aztec Empire, estimates vary wildly depending on which sources historians choose to credit. Some Spanish sources claim 20,000 to 50,000 people were sacrificed every year. Modern scholars suggest it was probably between 1,000 and 20,000 annually. The Aztec Empire existed for roughly 200 years. Even using extremely conservative estimates of 5,000 sacrifices per year across the empire, we're looking at a total death toll of 1 million people over 2 centuries. But why so many? What created this insatiable appetite for human blood? The answer lies in Aztec theology, which created an insatiable need. The sun needed feeding daily, or it wouldn't rise. Agricultural fertility required blood offerings. Victory in war required sacrifice. Major religious ceremonies demanded mass deaths. Natural disasters required appeasement offerings. The entire cosmic order, as the Aztecs understood it, was maintained through sacrifice. They even conducted special wars called flower wars, which were ritualized conflicts with neighboring states whose primary purpose wasn't territorial conquest, but capturing victims for sacrifice. These were scheduled battles with agreed-upon rules, fought specifically to obtain victims. For Aztec warriors, capturing enemies for sacrifice was the highest possible honor. Elite warriors, that is the jaguar warriors and eagle warriors you've probably seen depicted in art, achieved their status by capturing multiple enemies alive. Your entire social status depended on how many people you delivered to the pyramid. For the victims, the experience was absolute terror. Most were captured warriors who'd been defeated in battle. They knew their fate. They'd be kept in wooden cages, sometimes fattened up on good food to make them more impressive sacrifices, then marched up the pyramid steps to their death. Some evidence suggests victims were given hallucinogenic drugs to make them more compliant, or perhaps to provide them some escape from the horror of their final moments. But Spanish accounts also describe victims screaming, fighting, resisting, having to be physically dragged to the sacrificial altar. The practice ended abruptly when Spanish conquistadors, led by Hernán Cortés, conquered Tenochtitlan in 1521 after a brutal siege. The temples were destroyed, the skull racks were torn down. Catholic churches were built directly on top of the ruins of Aztec temples, literally covering the old religion with the new. Today, Mexico City sits on top of ancient Tenochtitlan. Construction projects regularly uncover remains, offering pits, skull racks, ceremonial knives, and sacrificial stones. Each discovery is a reminder that one of history's most magnificent civilizations, one that built a city of 200,000 people on an island in a lake, one that created extraordinary art and architecture and astronomical observations, was also built on a foundation of ritual killing. In sheer numbers, Aztec sacrifice likely exceeded all the other practices we've discussed today combined. While estimates vary enormously and we'll never know the true total, even the most conservative scholarly figures suggest hundreds of thousands died over the empire's duration. Here's what we must understand if we're to comprehend this at all. From the Aztec perspective, they weren't committing murder. They were maintaining cosmic order. They genuinely believed that without sacrifice, the sun wouldn't rise the next morning, crops wouldn't grow, rain wouldn't fall, the entire world would end in catastrophe. They were wrong, obviously. Completely, utterly wrong. The sun kept rising just fine after the Spanish shut down the operation, but they believed it with absolute conviction, and that belief created an industrial-scale apparatus of ritual killing that operated for 2 centuries, claiming countless lives. We've seen what happens when faith becomes fanaticism, when tradition overrides compassion, when collective belief justifies cruelty. The question we should ask ourselves isn't, how could they believe such things? The question is, what do we currently believe that future generations will find equally horrifying? Are there practices we accept today as normal that people in 2525 will look back on and say, what the hell were they thinking? Because I guarantee you there are. If you made it through all 38 minutes of this journey into humanity's darkest beliefs, congratulations, you have the stomach for real history. If you found this valuable, please like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments, what other dark historical practices should we explore? What beliefs and traditions deserve this kind of examination? Until next time, remember, just because everyone believes something doesn't make it right, it just makes it popular. See you in the next episode of The Mystic Explainer.